Awesome. Andrea, so we want to learn a bit about how you developed your artistic skills. So did you have like any influential mentors, teachers, or did you mostly learn your skills through self-taught learning? And also maybe did you also learn from other artists in your family or tribe?
I think I started making work when I was very, very young. Like everyone in my family is an artist. Typically does do people in my family do other jobs, but there's um, definitely it was encouraged. Like being an artist was is seen as just really important. So my dad is an artist. He's also a school teacher, and I come from a really long line of of artists up in Grand Portage. That's where my people are from. There's three museums and a very small population. There's a federal, like national monument. There's um, a state museum that's run with the tribe, and then there's a tribal museum. And that's a lot of museums for a population of under 1,000 people. But one of the museums that's run by Grand Portage, Ojibwe, is full of work by Raymond Duham, and he's my great uncle. I'm learning more of the stories of some of my family. He was in World War II. He was a paratrooper, and he lost the use of his legs. So when he came back from World War II, he started making dolls and regalia, dance regalia for powwows and loom rugs and just a number of furniture, just a lot of things that he could do with his hands, and he didn't need the use of his legs. So that museum is full of his work on the reservation. But but I think there's definitely inspiration comes from my family and my dad and my community members. um I always kind of uh joke around that there's like just different expressions of the same thing happening in the family. So a lot of bead workers, going back selling tchotchkes at the side of the road. And my older sister is delivery nurse for a NICU, for neonatal intensive care. And sometimes she has to put an IV into a very small baby. And she has to, it's like almost threading a beading needle. It's just a very fine motor skill type job. And myself as an artist, I feel like those very fine motor skills that I employ in my drawing and painting are probably inherited from years and years. I'm not sure if that's how genes work, but um, but I have a long family history of making things. And then of course my peer groups and I have a number of various peer groups that I've kind of gleaned knowledge from: comic book design and techniques, and friends that work with color pencil and painting. We all share techniques as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for going into depth about like how much your family was like influential in your developing artistic skills. Um, Next question is I'm looking at your artwork, specifically the Vor series. I'm a huge fan. But it's an act of resistance and decolonization. I know that you've talked about before. And you're calling on people to reevaluate the widespread misrepresentations of Native Americans and to recognize the role that institutions have had in conditioning people to believe these misconceptions. Particularly, your work addresses the harmful stereotypes perpetuated by popular cinema and the appropriation of cultural objects by museums. So, we were interested in learning about why you're interested in critiquing these specific forms of misrepresentations. Were there any historical events or personal experiences that led to your current arts focus?
Well, I went to school. My undergrad at the University of Minnesota is in art and American Indian Studies. So I was having these parallel educations where I was learning how to paint and draw at the same time as learning some really critical theory around American Indian studies. Then I went to grad school at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, and there I was kind of, more furthering my critical gaze. One of the things I became very interested in both undergrad and grad school was storytelling and how impactful stories are on people's worldviews, on our personally held beliefs, on how we construct and see the world. So, storytelling being such an incredibly powerful tool, when I graduated from with my master's degree from MCAD, my first museum exhibition was at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. And I had learned all of this critical theory about museum studies and about what museums have historically and even perpetually do to Indigenous people. So, but then having my artwork in a museum posed its own problem. That context I didn't want to necessarily take for granted. It was an opportunity to maybe challenge some of the storytelling that the museum was capable of doing. And so it was just such an incredible privilege and opportunity, but also, it carries with it a fair amount of emotional labor to go into these institutions that were not made for me, not made for Indigenous people, not made for people of color, not even made for women. Um, Typically, when Indigenous and Native artwork enters a museum, like an encyclopedic institution, we're erased in a way. They will say this quill basket or this quill birch bark box was made by an Anishinaabe woman or made by a Dakota woman or made by maybe even not a woman, just lives the tribe and not a human, not an individual person. So as part of that individuality that gets erased entering the museum, and sometimes our gender is even stripped from us. So we enter the museum anonymously or as a group alone. So I was thinking about narratives and how museums have been very irresponsible with these gifts, this powerful position of being this huge storyteller for Indigenous people all over the world, and how much they get wrong, how little is invested in who these artists even are. And at the same time, I'm kind of a film buff, so I was also watching a lot of various films and stumbled upon cannibal genre films, typically made in the 70s and 80s. There's an Italian cannibal film boom back in the 70s and 80s. But they were all the same story. A settler, some form of settler or invader would come into an indigenous community, either in Africa or South America or Southeast Asia. They'd do something terrible to the indigenous population. Then they would stick around long enough for the indigenous population to inflict revenge on them. So they're all revenge stories, but they're interesting because the revenge is reserved for the indigenous population that has zero character development. You don't know their story, only that they've been hurt and they've been victimized. And then from that positionality, they enact revenge on the characters that you've, as a viewer, followed up. So it's a very bizarre form of storytelling. And so by putting these film titles into those works of art and then showing them in museums, what I think I'm doing is kind of equating this very exploitation form of film, this super irresponsible, very exploitive filmmaking genre and storytelling, with the museum itself that likes to hold itself in high regard, that doesn't see itself as exploitive at all, but to kind of interlace these two things as having an equivalent, kind of being equivalent. Um, so I don't know if there's any personal experiences for how I came to those conclusions, other than my work, one way or another, was going to end up in museums, and that's an important context.
Thank you so much. I'll pass it over to Isaac.
Thank you. That's like really powerful. Um, our next question is, what message do you want people to take away from your work? Is there a certain reaction you're trying to spark in your audience?
Um, so that's a trickier question because I feel like I don't know, I always feel like my work is always emerging and that I haven't really established my career yet. And I always think that like perhaps in the future time will tell like its full impact. Like I haven't really reached a point where I'm as impactful as I want to be. And I also don't want to, speculate too much on what people take away from my work. But I do, I do hope that, you know, just being a Native woman occupying galleries, museums, homes in a big way. My work is really large. A lot of it is very large scale work. It's the impact of that can maybe be felt by a native person taking up a lot of space when that's typically not something that is offered, to women in general. Like we're just culturally supposed to make ourselves small and not be seen or, kind of the, get kind of put at the children's table often. So just making large work that is not easy to dismiss. Like you can't go into a gallery and see my work and walk past it and pretend you didn't see it because usually it hogs half a gallery space. So I think that, I mean, that's not what I set out to do. I wanted to make something that consumed the viewer in scale. But I do think that can be impactful to people when they learn more about who the artist was and who they're being consumed by these giant landscapes. So I mean, I hope that I hope that's an impact. I hope that just maybe even seeing the craft work of the drawings and paintings that other artists will see it um, and maybe be inspired to use their materials differently. Um, uh, but it's also hard to like take an image and have someone walk away with like this profound deep understanding when there's very few words in my art. It's not the same as like, I guess, reading a book or an article where things are, where you walk through it in a different way.
Uh, it's yeah, nobody can walk past your work. It's too gripping. It's amazing. um, what are some of the challenges you face, specifically as an Indigenous artist, when trying to get your art installed in institutions and museums? I know you were talking about how you had that attention because of what museums, um, the past. But if you could elaborate on some of those challenges.
I mean, the challenge is I feel like the more I'm in this, the more I like really invest in making art and committing to being an artist. I feel like the challenges almost every year become less and less. I feel like also museums are starting to pay attention in a way that they hadn't paid attention when I was, back in grad school or back when I was just starting out. I feel like museums are changing. They are understanding that they are, born out of colonization. And I used to, starting out, had to really make that case again and again. And I had a number of curators over the years tell me that I was wrong, that was just in the past, that, that accusing museums of having colonial histories, well, that's just it. It's a history. Not that, curators not accepting that they were inheriting some of these modes of doing business that were still very harmful. Um, and and now that I've been in this long enough, I've come up with a number of rebuttals for criticism when I have criticized museums and the way that they've done things. You hear these same answers again and again and again. So as an artist, it gives you the opportunity to reformulate your response or reformulate your questions. So by now, 'cause I'm 41, by now I kind of have more or less a well-oiled machine when it comes to addressing museum violence and museum harm. Um, the things like the ancestors that are part of museum collections in cardboard boxes in their storage facilities. There's things like that, but there's also um, things like not paying artists what they're worth. Uh, Oftentimes museums ask for discounts because they're museums. So they're since they're prestigious collection, an artist should be honored to have their work in a museum. So they'll ask for a 10% discount, like blanket ask. Every museum does it. So maybe when a museum approaches an artist of color or a female artist, maybe don't have a policy where you ask for a 10% discount because we're already discounted. We don't make the same um the cents on a dollar. We don't make the same off of our artwork as our colleagues. Um so I think that there's so much work that those are just a couple of suggestions, but there's so many little bits and pieces that museums cling on to when it comes to exploitation. And sometimes you have to kind of demonstrate their exploitation with really almost large gestural strokes in order for them to notice what they're doing, or to notice that they've erased someone. And I think one of the big things when you look at like land acknowledgement statements that a number of institutions are doing, and how those hadn't been done for years, and you could, for decades you could talk to any curator of a contemporary art museum and a encyclopedic museum, and they wouldn't be able to tell you whose land their museum sits on. And often it's stolen land, and they can't even tell you the nation of where they live, where they sustain their lives, and where they extract resources. And I feel like with land acknowledgements, that is this little crack in the plaster where hopefully we can start seeing more accountability, more representation, more more people of color, women, and Indigenous people on the inside of institutions making decisions that are more serving of these communities. So that's where I'm at.
Absolutely. Everything you said was definitely on point, and it even brings me back to when at one point I was in New Zealand, and it was literally like culture shock to just like see people, white people looking people, like acknowledge like what Maori like people even go through like with culture, and then like for like language wise, and like actually just like I don't know, engaging with like what's called land recognition, which you're talking about. So it's definitely like there's a lot of hope for, especially for how America can progress, since there has already been, we see this like progression with in other countries too and stuff. And but I'm definitely looking forward to seeing like the impact that you're having your art in museums, institutions, and other people of color, Indigenous folks in there. So yeah, we just kind of want to end with our last question. So you talked about hardships for having your work installed. So we want to know more about like what has inspired you and motivated you to continue creating art despite these hardships.
Um, I think that starting out in my career, I wanted to take the front door into an institution, into a museum. I wanted the door that was afforded white men, white male artists that seemed like they could go from subject to subject, and they could be this, um, make art about various subjects as though they had that authority of an artist. I wanted that for myself. I wanted to, you know, uh, just be able to float into a museum and maybe have the universality that is offered to white male artists. That's what I wanted at the beginning. And then over the years, my career changed, and I decided that although I want that for myself, although I want equality, um, I also cherish Indigenous people. I cherish women and people of color. And I am not necessarily doing it for the institution. I want to impress my colleagues. I want to impress my peers. I want to impress my fellow artists. That in itself is a very rewarding career. And also, I shouldn't look at opportunities that are afforded to me by Native people that might be a side door into an institution. If I'm considering those as being less, what does that say about my views towards Indigenous people and the spaces that we make for each other? If anything, I should locate my desire in those spaces, in these reciprocal relationships that I can have with arts writers and curators and other Native artists. So I'm starting to totally calibrate my where I locate my desire and where I locate what I prioritize in my career. Who am I centering? If I'm just performing for institutions and for non-natives, what is that? What does that really say about me? So I try not to bring any of this into my studio. Like I want to make something that is different, that challenges me, that is where like has it's not all just criticism, that there's joy in it. I want to also, do technically skilled drawing and painting that artists that are mostly into technical skill can look at it and get satisfaction out of my work. So I'm in my studio for various reasons, but I have noticed that that I there's been a shift in my career and where I'm placing value. I think the other, it's not really a part of the long scope of my career, but just recently during the pandemic, I've also noticed that living in a city like Chicago, that I desire getting outside and I desire getting into large open spaces. And I think that the pandemic is probably teaching a lot of artists that isolate like I do, that that's probably not the at the end of all of this, at the end of the pandemic, that I think that the isolation is also maybe one of those like possessive ownership type way of creating art, and it might be nice to maybe open that up, do more collaborations post pandemic, and get out of the major cities every once in a while. That might be where my career will end up.
Wow, that's so great. It's just very motivating to work to just empower yourself and your people, just to do it, just to feel that energy. I love it.
Yeah.
We don't have any more questions, but we loved everything you had. Thank
Absolutely.
you so much.